July 1945. A war crimes preliminary hearing facility near Wiesbaden, Germany. Inside the makeshift courtroom, the air is thick with midsummer heat and the smell of damp paper. SS Hauptsturmführer Erich Vogel sits at the defense table, his uniform clean, his jaw set, and his eyes fixed on the American prosecutor. The 33-year-old captain has just submitted a formal 12-page motion, written in precise German and citing international legal precedent. He is demanding a trial by a court of military peers, composed entirely of professional soldiers, who understand the harsh realities of occupation duty. He explicitly requests the complete exclusion of French civilians, concentration camp survivors, and resistance fighters from the proceedings, calling their potential presence vengeance rather than justice. He is certain that fellow officers will grant him professional courtesy and view his actions as necessary counterinsurgency. He believes his unearned privilege will protect him from the ruins of the Reich. A single command from General George S. Patton will ensure this German officer faces a jury he never anticipated, turning his legal maneuver into his own public undoing. This is the story of what happened when a defeated SS captain demanded the honor of a military tribunal, only to be confronted by the very people he tried to erase. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when the loser still thinks he is the master, bringing the hidden truths of justice and consequences to light. Major Sarah Cohen was 36 years old, from New York, and served as a war crimes prosecutor with the Judge Advocate General's Corps. In civilian life, she had been a sharp corporate lawyer specializing in international law, a career she readily abandoned to join the military effort. She had spent the months following the German surrender, digging through captured documents, unearthing the dark machinery of the occupation. Her latest case file was heavy, anchored by a detailed German after-action report, a list of survivors, and photographs of a trench filled with bodies. She carried the weight of 89 murdered civilians from a French village called Saint-Cleur. The loss that drove her was not a personal wound, but a professional fury at the systematic destruction of law. She was determined to ensure the dead were not forgotten in the chaos of peace. She sat at the prosecution table, her eyes fixed on the 12-page motion that sought to bar those very victims from the courtroom. SS Hauptsturmführer Erich Vogel was 33 years old, from Düsseldorf, and belonged to the Waffen-SS. He had joined the black uniformed organization in 1936, rising through the ranks during occupation duties in Poland, Yugoslavia, and finally France. He believed completely in the racial hierarchy of the Reich, often stating that subversives had no rights under the laws of war. In June 1944, he had personally ordered the execution of 89 civilians in Saint-Cleur as a reprisal for a resistance ambush. The dead included 31 women and 17 children, an action he officially recorded as necessary counterinsurgency. Even now, in captivity, his boots were polished, his uniform was neatly pressed, and he maintained the rigid posture of a man who believed he belonged to a superior caste. He viewed the American legal process as a mere formality that he could outmaneuver by appealing to professional military solidarity. He believed his uniform still carried honor. By July 1945, the European theater had shifted from a battlefield of tanks and artillery to a landscape of legal reckonings and administrative chaos. The Third Reich had collapsed into 4 occupation zones, and millions of displaced persons, former prisoners, and surrendering soldiers choked the ruined roads of Germany. In the aftermath of total war, American military authorities were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of alleged atrocities waiting for investigation. Preliminary hearing facilities, like the one near Wiesbaden, were quickly established in former municipal buildings and schoolhouses to sort through the mountain of evidence before formal trials could begin. In this environment of transition, the rules were still being written. Many regular American Army officers, exhausted by years of combat, were inclined to handle surrendering German personnel with standard military protocols, often treating captured officers with traditional professional courtesies. Some commanders let administrative technicalities slide, preferring to clear their desks rather than untangle the complex web of occupation crimes. The German officer corps quickly recognized this tendency, attempting to exploit the shared bond of military service to shield themselves from civilian justice. They argued that their actions were merely harsh, tactical decisions forced upon them by the brutal nature of partisan warfare. They sought shelter under the laws of war, hoping their American captors would overlook the civilian blood on their hands in favor of maintaining order. Major Cohen refused to let the system normalize the slaughter of innocents. The 12-page motion sat on her desk, waiting for a signature that would either validate the SS captain's arrogance or smash it completely. Major Cohen looked up from the defense motion as the military bailiff escorted the prisoner into the small interrogation room. She held the stapled pages in one hand, her thumb marking the paragraph where the SS officer demanded a tribunal of his professional peers. "We should discuss your submission, Captain Vogel," Major Cohen said, keeping her tone flat and professional. "I expect nothing less from an officer of the court," Vogel answered, adjusting his cuffs as he sat. "You have spent 12 pages outlining why civilian survivors should be barred from the room," Cohen said, tapping the document against the table. "It is a question of jurisprudence, not emotion," Vogel replied, leaning back in his chair. "A military operation can only be judged properly by men who have held a perimeter, who understand the necessity of counterinsurgency. You ordered the execution of 89 people in Saint-Cleur, including women and children," Cohen said, her voice dropping an octave. "That is not an operation, that is mass murder." "It was a standard reprisal under martial law," Vogel said, his voice rising slightly with cold confidence. "The partisans killed 2 of my men. The local population sheltered them. In the field, an officer must make decisions to preserve order. And those decisions are protected by the customs of war. The customs of war do not cover the shooting of a newborn baby, Captain," Cohen said, leaning forward. "You are a civilian in a uniform, Major. You do not understand the chain of command," Vogel said, his face hardening as he pointed a manicured finger at her. "I am a regular officer of a recognized formation. I have a right to be judged by soldiers who understand duty, not by French peasants, communist terrorists, or Jewish lawyers who only want revenge." Major Cohen stood up slowly, her face entirely blank. She gathered the motion, her red pen, and the folder containing the after-action report. "This discussion is over, Captain," Cohen said. "I assume my motion will be forwarded to the proper authorities," Vogel said, smoothing his tunic. "It will go exactly where it belongs," Cohen answered. She walked out of the interrogation room without looking back, closing the heavy wooden door behind her. The arrogance of the SS officer had been laid bare on the record, typed out in his own defense and repeated to her face. She took the stairs to the administrative office, 2 at a time, heading straight for the clerk's desk. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. The roar of his jeep cut through the afternoon heat outside the facility, and the sound of his boots echoed down the concrete corridor seconds later. 4 stars flashed on his helmet, and the ivory-handled revolvers rested in the holsters on his hips. He walked into the prosecutor's office unannounced, the heavy report held in his hand. Every clerk and officer in the room straightened instantly. He did not say a word as he walked to the center of the floor, his face fixed in a cold, hard glare. "Bring the German captain to the hearing room," Patton said. The general stood by the window as Vogel was escorted in. The SS officer saw the 4 stars on Patton's uniform and offered a sharp, disciplined salute. Patton did not return it. He studied the prisoner for a long moment, his eyes scanning the polished boots and the clean uniform. "You wrote this motion, Captain," Patton said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room. "I did, General," Vogel answered, his chin held high. "I requested a tribunal of my professional peers." "You believe you are a soldier," Patton said. "I served my country in the field for 6 years," Vogel said. "I commanded men in combat. And you believe a military court will understand your actions in Saint-Cleur," Patton said. "Yes, General," Vogel said. "Officers understand the heavy burden of keeping order in a hostile territory." Patton stepped away from the window, his voice dropping into a low, cutting register. "You are not a soldier, Captain. A soldier fights men who can fight back. You took 89 unarmed civilians into a field and shot them in the back of the head. You signed the order. You watched the blood pool in the dirt, and then you went back to your quarters to eat a warm dinner. That is not military duty. That is the work of a common butcher." The general stepped closer, his shadow falling over the prisoner. "You want a jury of your peers. You think your peers are the men who wear stars on their shoulders, or the officers who hold commissions. They are not. Your peers are the people who know exactly what you are, because they watched you do it. You have two choices today. You can withdraw this motion right now and face the court, or I will have you chained to a post in the center of Saint-Cleur and let the villagers hold their own tribunal. Decide in the next 10 seconds. Vogel stared at the general, his breathing shallow. The arrogance drained from his face as he looked into Patton's eyes. He nodded once, his head bowing slightly. "I will accept the court," Vogel whispered. The heavy wooden doors of the hearing room swung open on their hinges. Major Cohen stood as the bailiff led the witnesses into the courtroom in a quiet, single-file line. 11 survivors from the village of Saint-Cleur walked past the defense table, their wooden shoes scraping softly against the stone floor. Marie Dubois, 62 years old, walked at the front, her eyes locked onto the German captain who had ordered the execution of her husband and 2 sons. Behind her came Father Henri Marchand, the 54-year-old village priest who had witnessed the entire massacre through the stained glass of his church window. 3 French resistance fighters followed, including Robert Farr, his hands heavily scarred from the torture he had endured in Vogel's cells. The survivors took their places in the front row of the gallery, creating a solid wall of silent accusation just 3 feet from the defendant's chair. Vogel stared straight ahead, his face pale and glistening with sweat, as the smell of old wool and French tobacco filled the small room. He looked down at his polished boots, unable to hold the collective glare of the people he had tried to destroy. Major Sarah Cohen remained with the War Crimes Commission until the final tribunals concluded, eventually returning to her New York practice in late 1946. She lived a long, quiet life in Brooklyn, occasionally lecturing on international law, before passing away in her sleep in 1989. The thick, leather folder containing the Saint-Cleur after-action report stayed in her personal study until her death, a silent testament to the day the law regained its teeth. Erich Vogel stood before a mixed military-civilian tribunal 2 weeks later, the panel including 2 American judges and 1 civilian magistrate from the French resistance network. The 11 survivors testified one by one, their voices steady as they identified the captain from the witness stand. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging, a judgment carried out in November 1945 at Landsberg Prison. He spent his final days writing bitter letters to his family, claiming he was a victim of Victor's justice. General Patton never mentioned the hearing in his public statements, keeping his handwritten notes inside his personal diary. He wrote a single line in a letter to his wife on the evening of the confrontation, noting that some men only understand the weight of their boots when they are forced to look at the ants they tried to crush. Some historians have argued that the inclusion of civilian survivors and the threat of extrajudicial tribunals compromised the strict legal neutrality required of the American military government during the post-war transition. They contend that allowing emotional testimony in preliminary hearings set a dangerous precedent that risked turning international law into a vehicle for theater and political retribution. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that true justice in the wake of total war required breaking traditional military courtesy to confront systemic atrocities directly. What is certain is that the procedure established a precedent where documentation and eyewitness corroboration formed the bedrock of the subsequent Nuremberg processes, permanently altering how modern international tribunals define accountability for crimes against humanity. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have allowed the SS captain his military jury? Or would you have forced him to face the survivors of his own crimes? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when the loser still thinks he is the master, make sure to subscribe.